We're going to start now. Welcome to the webinar, Racism, Reproductive Justice, and the New York City Monument to Dr. J. Marion Sims. My name is Lynn Paltrow, and I'm the founder and executive director of National Advocates for Pregnant Women. And for those of you who are new to our work, we're a nonprofit legal advocacy organization that contributes to the struggle for civil and human rights for all people, focusing particularly on pregnant women and those most likely to be targeted for punishment. We challenge the ways in which both the criminal justice system and the civil child welfare systems are being used as mechanisms to punish people who become pregnant, who carry their pregnancies to term, who have abortions, or who experience pregnancy losses. We are thrilled to have with us this afternoon two extraordinary experts, Dr. Jennifer Morgan and Dr. Deirdre Cooper-Owens, who are very generously here today to help us answer, or at least inform the answers to such questions as, who is Dr. Marion Sims? What is a statute honoring him, honoring someone who experimented on enslaved Black women doing in East Harlem, New York City? And what do we need to know in order to take actions that will ensure that our present-day monuments, as well as our policies, address and redress our long and continuing history of white supremacy and misogyny? Before I turn this over to our two amazing experts, I wanted to share with you how I first learned about Dr. Marion Sims. I was speaking to somebody, I was learning more about birthing rights and allied organizations concerned with how women are treated when they give birth. And I was speaking to somebody from an organization called the Coalition for Improving Maternity Services, which today is part of the Improving Birth Coalition. During the course of the conversation, I learned a great deal, and at some point I asked if the Coalition for Improving Maternity Services was referred in a shorthand way to as Sims. I was quickly and forcefully told absolutely not, that it was referred to as Kims with a hard C, so as not to be confused or connected to confused with or connected in any way to Dr. Sims, a white man who was credited with developing gynecological surgeries by experimenting on enslaved Black women. As a result of my own work, I knew that experimentation on Black women was continuing and a present part of American history. As part of our case against the Medical University of South Carolina, where a white nurse, police, and prosecutors developed a policy of secretly searching their Black pregnant patients for evidence of cocaine use, and then turning it over to the police and coordinating their in-hospital arrests, it turned out that they were really also conducting an experiment that had not been approved, to which the women themselves not only were being subjected to arrest, but hadn't consented. And they published a medical journal article. It was not peer-reviewed. It was in Croc, that basically said we did an experiment on these women to see if threatening them with arrest and arresting them would reduce their use of cocaine. We filed a complaint, or I have a copy of it. It's a complaint with the Office for the Protection of Research Risks. And I'm proud to say that it was one of the first steps in that case in which there was some accountability. And that office said that they, in fact, had conducted research without the proper procedures. They were put on probation and threatened with loss of all of their research funding. Today, we have statutes honoring Dr. Sims in New York City and in Columbia, South Carolina, that have become the focus of significant ongoing and growing protest. With help from our summer 2017 intern, Laura Hatt, NAPW added its voice to an already existing chorus of organizations and activists demanding that the full story of Dr. Sims be told. Today, to help us do that and to answer some of the questions I mentioned before, are Dr. Jennifer Morgan. She is a New York University professor of social and cultural analysis and history and chairperson of the Department of Social and Cultural Analysis. She received her PhD in history from Duke University. Dr. Morgan is the author of Laboring Women, Gender and Reproduction in the Making of New World Slavery. She is also, I am very proud and lucky to say, an NAPW board member. you. And I hope I have to say the way I met and learned of Jennifer Morgan was through her father, a professor of pharmacology and a leader in exposing the myths and misinformation perpetuated by the failed ongoing war on drugs. And we have also with us today Dr. Deirdre Cooper Owens. She's an assistant professor of history at Queens College, CUNY. She holds an MA in African American Studies from Clark Atlanta University and a PhD in history from the University of California, Los Angeles, where she also received a certificate in women's studies. And I have this line written, you can see I'm reading. We are very much looking forward to her forthcoming book, Medical Bondage, Race, Gender, and the Origins of American Gynecology, only it's actually already out. And among the information we'll be sending and follow up to this webinar is how to find both of these books and other connections to activists and organizations. I'm going to turn this over. There's going to be really a conversation between our two guests, our two experts. I'll occasionally maybe ask a question. They'll do that for about 30 minutes, and then we will open it up to questions, which you should ask by using the chat function. Not the chat function, the question and answer function, written questions. And we will get some historical context and a whole lot more. And thank you very, very much for joining us. And now I turn it over.
So how about if we start by talking about what reproductive justice means?
Okay, that's a great question. And we could talk the entire webinar about reproductive justice. But I wrote down a few words because it encompasses so much. So a group of African American women in the United States in 1994 coined the term reproductive justice after attending a global conference on women's rights. And so what reproductive justice does is invites us all to examine reproductive issues through women's human rights framework. And so the issues run the gamut from bodily self-determination to abortion, population control, economic justice, immigrant rights, and the list goes on and on. But what it actually does in presenting that framework is allowing new practices that does not make reproductive justice a synonym for pro-choice or pro-abortion, but really widens that to recognize the humanity of women and women-identified people.
And for me, as a historian, I think for both of us as historians, part of what we're interested in is thinking about reproductive justice in relationship to enslaved women. And so I really wanted to start by reminding us, so we're gonna, for those of you who don't know, we're gonna talk about who Sims was and what he is referred to as the father of American gynecology. My colleague, Professor Cooper Owens' book really gives you an enormously important analysis of him and his role and the field of gynecology in relationship to both enslaved women and to poor white women, immigrant women. But before we go there, I just wanted to say that enslaved women's reproductive lives were always a crucial aspect of their enslavement, well before we get to the 1840s with Dr. Sims. In fact, the possibility, the probability that a woman who was enslaved would give birth to children who would then enrich the pocket of the slave owner is embedded in what slavery is and what hereditary racial slavery is. So the idea that's really crucial to the work that I have done on the history of slavery is that reproduction is at the center. So we can't understand slavery. We can't understand what it means to be commodified under slavery without understanding the connection to the processes of commodification and how that process gets located in African women's wombs. And so for me, by the time we get to Sims, hundreds of years, literally hundreds of years of slave owning practices have unfolded in the Atlantic world at the hands of the Spanish, the hands of the Portuguese, the French, the English, the Dutch, all of whom are interested in making sure wherever they can, that enslaved women will have children. Sometimes those will be children who are fathered by other enslaved men. Often they will be children fathered by slave owners. They make sure that those children will follow the condition of their mothers. In other words, that no matter who that child's father is, that child will be property of the slave owner, of the man who owns, usually the man, sometimes the woman, who owns that woman's body. That is so foundational to how we get to Sims, how we get to the point in which a person can, in which Sims's experimental relationship to Anarcha and Lucy and Betsy is authorized,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So
yeah, it's interesting. So, what I often do when I have conversations with people, and I've been having a lot of conversations actually about Sims with journalists, is to always remind them to center Black women's experiences. And much later, once Sims literally transports himself and his family to New York City, to think about poor foreign-born women where Blackness was mapped onto their body. And so that's really my framework for having us understand the 19th century Southern world, but also a product of that world. And Sims was most certainly a product of that world, born in South Carolina. He's educated in the medical schools there, travels to Philadelphia, to the Jefferson Medical College, another founding father, right? I mean, there's like this love fest with calling elite white men father. And so he goes to Jefferson Medical School. And this is the thing that most people find shocking. Medical students could not practice on live bodies. And so essentially 19th century medicine is extremely exploratory. It's experimental in many senses by its very nature. And so he moves back to South Carolina and he treats the entire community. And of course, this would mean a slave holding community, but also an enslaved community. Once 2 slave children died, because of the nature of 19th century medicine, he is so shamed that he moves his family to the West, which is Alabama. And he talks about this in his memoirs, where he has to establish his name by working on really the folk that he considers kind of the dregs of society. So he says, free niggers, Jews, and poor whites. And so once he is able to build up a reputation, he is now able to offer his services to other slave owners. And this is where his interest in treating women comes about. And it was really because a white lady, as he calls her in his book, in his article, falls off a horse, her uterus is reversed. He's able to turn her uterus right side up. And so he has this idea because a number of slave owners approached him to repair a common condition, right? We now call it in the 21st century obstetrical fistula, but it's caused by the trauma of having a prolonged birth. So you could be in labor for 2 to 3 days because of the friction that happens with obstetrical fistula. It was called vesicovaginal fistula. Then what happens is holes are formed. That's what fistula means. The bladder is exposed because the bladder is very close to the upper vaginal area, and incontinence happens. If there are tears in the vaginal area or the anus, then you can have incontinence coming from both ends. So it's not a condition that's debilitating, but it is one that ostracizes you, and also you can get sores and those types of things, infections, right? And these are young women, so you can imagine. Women who are prized for breeding, for reproducing, and they're unable to function in that capacity. So, all right, so they're sent there. Sims begins experimentation. And yet the fiction that we've been told for so long is the first women's hospital is founded by Sims in New York. And I'm like, so Sims talks about this. The first women's hospital he found
in Alabama
is founded on his slave farm in Alabama.
Mm-hmm.
And he goes into contractual agreements with not just Anarcha Betsy Lucy's owners, but about 6 more women. And he talks to these folk and he says, I will repair your property. And so this idea that he is somehow benevolent, he's doing what slave owners have done since the beginning of slavery in colonial America. They enter into contractual agreements so that property can be improved.
And can I wanted to, there are two things I think that you just said that are so important. One is, like, I think it's important that we don't minimize the fact that the fistula was a devastating condition, right? The incontinence, the risk of infection, the pain, like these are not, I don't want to, I don't,
ostracized from your friends and family.
Exactly,
Exactly.
That's hugely important for the woman who experiences it. But what's also important is that the incontinence, the smell of urine, the leaking of urine and feces makes you lowers your value in the market. It makes it impossible for you to serve in a domestic capacity. So for slave owners, this is a condition that they are particularly attentive to in women who work in the household. In other words, if Anarcha or Betsy or Lucy are leaking urine in the plantation owner's home, that reduces their value. So that's the other, it's important. So the statue of Sims, the first way that he is described is surgeon and philanthropist. In other words, that he does these things out of the goodness of his heart. And I think it's really important that we remember that there is a market here. There's a market that says, that supports Sims' scientific medical interests.
And it is based on the racial etiquette and racial social contract that he enters into. There's nothing benevolent about what he's doing. It is a business agreement. And so if he were to damage, and I think for me, this is where context becomes important, because Sims has been painted as either a martyr or a monster. And I'm like, things are a lot more complicated than that. This is not a man who wanted to mangle or butcher women's bodies. He could have been sued. He would have had to pay a lot of money, and he was incurring the cost of this 5-year experimental trial by himself. And so, it would be against his interest to not repair their fistula. And so he's working his hardest. Now, this is where the slavery component comes in. And I tell people, I said, now these women are patients, and yet they have to, they're nurses. The white community abandons their support of Sims after about 2 to 3 years. You're not healing these women. They aren't cured. You're losing money, it's affecting your family. Sims has a sick child, so they say, we're done. They leave him alone. So what does Sims do? Sims is a slave owner, and he's now a slave owner who has added more slaves to his household.
Because the slave owners have transferred Anarcha, Betsy, and Lucy to Sims.
You've said their names several times. Could you just talk?
So, and I wanted, so there are many, many women who are the subject of medical experimentation on the hands of Southern slave-owning doctors. We know Anarcha, Betsy, and Lucy's names because Sims writes an autobiography in 1890, 89?
It was in the, oh goodness, I want to say 1883 or something.
So he publishes an autobiography called The Story of My Life, in which he tells us their names. And so for many of us, the repeating of their names is crucial because it's so often the case that we don't know the names of enslaved women and we don't have their names in the record. I think that so I say their names. We say their names.
And that's the thing too, that there were others though. And that's what I always tell people. And Anarcha, Betsy, and Lucy were not the only ones. There were 17 people that Sims owned, 12 of whom were adults, 5 of whom were children. And so we say their names with the knowledge that there are still others who are not identified, that he did not think enough of his other patients to name them. Right? And so that becomes very important. But also, I think the context of what Sims does, has been, I think, privileged more than it should. Because there were other, as Jennifer said, there were other men doing the same work for C-sections, right? This man, Francois-Marie Provost, leaves Haiti, where he does experimental work on Haitian slaves. The Haitian Revolution happened, and so he skips town, skips to another country, settles in Louisiana, and begins the same experimental practices on enslaved women there to perfect the cesarean section.
And can I interrupt you there, because this is so important. So I'm sure that everyone in our audience understands that part of what we're dealing with here is the legacy of racism. The idea that Black people were somehow were different enough that we could be enslaved and that the mark of race makes you enslavable. But one of the key arguments that we have to be clear about here, and it's something that that Deirdre does so well in her book, is talks about the way that Blackness is mapped onto other women's bodies. So these scientists, these men, these doctors, and I put them in quotes, but maybe they shouldn't be in quotes. These doctors know that if they fix the fistula in Anarcha's body, they will then be able to fix the fistula in the white lady's body. They know that if they can successfully undertake a cesarean birth, that they will be able to save white women, wealthy women, from death in childbirth. So it's this really crucial connection between racial difference and sameness. So that race is what, Blackness is what makes it possible for Sims to perform 36 procedures on Anarcha's body before he gets it right. He goes back and back and back, right? Race is what lets him do that. But race is also what turns him into a philanthropist and the founder of a white women's hospital in New York. And that is, it's so important that we understand that.
Yeah, and it's interesting too. I think this is the part of the story for me that I was also drawn on. I'm a historian of slavery, and I always joke, I stumbled into medicine because I went to a Black women's college. I always joke I have one of the Blackest experiences. I literally was not in integrated environment until I was 30. I'm 45 now. So I have a very specific set of cultural experiences that's rooted in African America. And I thought, how in the world did I go to 2 HBCUs and I never knew about Sims? I'm a South Carolina native, never knew about this man. And so what was interesting for me in the concept of mapping Blackness onto degraded bodies, Sims comes to New York, sets up this hospital. First patient is a transient poor Irish immigrant woman who had lived in the States for maybe a year or two. And he and his associate described her as a loathsome creature who had the worst fistula that he had ever seen. And so he literally treats Mary Smith's body in the same way that he treats those enslaved women in Alabama. So just as he made those slaves work to build his hospital, and he taught them surgical procedures, he also made Mary Smith work in the women's hospital as she was being experimented on by him. And he, in fact, experimented on Mary's body a year longer than he did his enslaved patients. And so this is a part of the story, I think, that has been excised out because the ways in which we understand oppression is solely rooted in race and Blackness. And so what I'm saying is, let's look at also these connections when we talk about sameness and difference to poor foreign-born bodies. That in the 19th century, if you were the newest immigrant to occupy a Black space, right, that these Southern doctors who are moving to the North are treating them in very similar ways.
In a way, it's as though Sims serves as a way for us to understand the education of white supremacy, right? So that he learns how to treat, he learned how to degrade Mary Smith in this way that makes her function as as you said, as a degraded being, right? So the Irish are going to become white over the course of the 19th century, but Mary Smith isn't there yet. And Sims, as he moves from Alabama to New York, he brings I don't know, the results of his education on the bodies of Anarcha, Lucy, and Betsy, and the others into New York City. And that's why he's here. So there are 3 statues that I know of Sims. One is in the Montgomery, Alabama, on the lawn there at the state capitol. One is in Columbia, South Carolina, also at the state capitol. And one is on Fifth Avenue and 103rd Street here in New York City, across from the American, what is it? I'm sorry.
The New York Academy.
The Academy of Medicine, across from the New York Academy of Medicine. So that the commemoration of Sims follows this route from the south to the north, and it's a route that we need to understand. That the conversations that are happening right now about commemoration and about how we remember history are not solely a conversation that needs to happen in the South by any means. It's a conversation that may push us into that part of the conversation a little prematurely. I want to stay with Sims for a while,
Well, no, let me just give you a chance to catch your breath and say, I'm seeing on the screen that a couple of people have raised their hands. I really have no idea what that means. So if you have a question and can use the Q&A function, this fabulous Zoom technology, we'll be able to read your question and hopefully answer it.
Well, I did see one question that asked whether this would be recorded and they would have access to it after.
Yes.
Let me answer that question, which is we are going to do our very best to, we are recording this and we are going to do our best to turn this into an accessible podcast, and we'll let you know when that happens. So the first question is, Sims also treated Anarcha during a second round for fistula in the New York Women's Hospital in 1856, years after his experiments in Montgomery ended. Is that significant?
I don't know that to be true. I've never run into any sources. By the time Sims leaves, so this is the thing, Sims becomes very ill after he publishes this article, the groundbreaking article on curing vesicovaginal fistula in 1852. He opens up the Women's Hospital in 1855
in New York.
In New York. The thing is, Sims sells his hospital to one of the young men, Nathan Bozeman, who was considered a surgical assistant of his. In Alabama. So the thing is, and Anarcha, Betsy, Lucy, and those other women had to be released back to their owners per the agreement of that contract that he entered into. He could not. She was not his slave to have after the experiments ended.
Maybe the questioner is so he does continue to perform experiments, but it's on Mary Smith. But it's on, right. So once he gets to New York, it's on poor Irish women. There was another, okay. So Jack El Hai had, so we should.
Yeah, I like I said, I've been doing this for over 10 years and I know a number of scholars. I have never run into that, but I will look into it. Anarcha was leased in Alabama in Mount Meigs. She lived right outside of it.
Okay, so we'll circle back around to that. But I think the other question has to do with this notion of difference and sameness.
Yes.
So the question is, how did 19th century physicians reconcile Enlightenment era racial ideologies of difference that often justified slavery, and perhaps even the inhumanness of treating African Americans as chattel, yet call upon anatomical similarities between the races. So this is something that that we touched on earlier that I think cannot be that we need to return to. It's very easy, I think, to imagine that part of the edifice of racial slavery is this insurmountable difference, right? And when I'm teaching, I often talk, students will use this phrase that, slave owners didn't recognize the humanity of those they enslaved. Of course they did. They were talking to them, they were teaching them how to work in the ways that they wanted them, and they were having sex with them.
And they were taught sometimes by them.
And they were learning from them, exactly. So difference and sameness is always in tension. And part of the tension is that if you are if you are marked as African or the descendant of Africans, you are enslavable. Your owner owns your children. He understands, often intimately, that your body is the same as his wife's. But the way that he's allowed to use your body is quite different. So I think that we give I think that if we believe that slave owners saw Black people as absolutely different, doesn't it let them off the hook? Doesn't it you say, well, they didn't understand that Black people were the same as them? Of course they understood it. They just used race and Blackness as a way to authorize very different behavior. And I think that that's really at the heart of what of this, what is the tension between difference and sameness, and how do we work through that?
And I often talk about the duality of being considered legally property. So you are an object, and yet at the same time you are very different than a chair, right? Than a chicken. And so the fact that we talk about reproductive labor and enslaved women, and we move from the womb to the breast, right? And the fact that you can create an entire industry based on breastfeeding, that one becomes a wet nurse, not just to enslaved children, but to white children in that community, that you can trust that the milk a Black slave woman produces can be nourishing for a white child, shows you, right, that there is a fiction around this idea that Black people were so different. So the thing is, you have to toe the line in terms of the racialized language of the day and the racial etiquette. So this is why men like Sims and all of his colleagues, and there are numbers of them, right? Sims isn't that exceptional. He is really a part of a cohort of 19th century medical men doing this kind of work. But they can say, oh, I gained consent from the slaves, when what they really mean is, I've gained consent from the slave owners. But because they recognize that object is a human being, you still have to write about this object as if she is human, because you know that she is.
And Douglas Sims also, he talks about Anarcha and Betsy and Lucy as wanting him to perform these procedures on them. So he, in his autobiography, he feels the need to claim that they have come to him voluntarily for his services, and that she is so grateful to have the fistula finally repaired, that the 36 procedures are nothing to her, right? And so, and again, so I don't want to minimize the desire to have a fistula repaired, right? But it's what's really, I think, crucial here is that Sims wants his reader to know that he is
slave owners were paternalistic, they were benevolent, you know, they cared for the other members of their family, right? I mean, and that really is what it is. It's written, his memoir is written after the Civil War. And so Sims, as the president of, by the 1870s, 1880s, he has been president of the New York Academy of Medicine, the American Medical Association. So Sims also has to address the race question and the woman question, as it was called then, in a very particular way, without demonizing himself and demonizing those men like him who taught him. And so yes, he's going to say, oh, but they clamored. And I'm thinking, well, if I were being cut open, and I was having surgery done, I might clamor for opiate because it makes you feel good. It makes you go to sleep, right? And so for me, it's not whether that statement is true or not, because even as a historian, I wasn't there, right? I have to use context clues, but I also have to think about the physiological responses of an opiate being given to an enslaved patient, where it's addictive, number one, but also it eases some of the pain because it creates constipation, and so you're not going to be tearing those surgical scars. Right? And so those are things that Sims is doing because of his training, right? And, people don't necessarily understand addictions in the ways that we do now in the 21st century, But, you know, once again, it contextualizes, I think, the 19th century medical world in ways where we see he wasn't just pushing drugs to them. This was very common to use by all doctors during the 1840s.
So, should we talk a little bit about commemoration
Yes.
and about the statue?
Yeah.
I feel like there might be.
How do we?
I think you have to say that they're answered, so that, and then you
Done.
press done, and then because then I think there might be another question. There we go.
But we can talk. I think we should talk about commemoration.
Yeah, and then we'll come back to questions. But so if you answer those, and then. So for those of you who are not aware, and we'll share links about the protests that have taken place around the Sims statue in New York City. The mayor of Columbia, South Carolina, is making moves to remove the statue from Columbia, as far as I understand. But the New York City Parks Department has also been engaged in a conversation with local communities, community activists, and others who've been protesting the statue. So there's been a conversation here in New York about what makes sense. You know, Sims is not a Confederate general, but Sims is, he stands alone, quite literally, along Fifth Avenue in a very prominent, it's a very large statue, and in a way that completely erases the work that not just, and again, I want to emphasize this is something that that Deirdre emphasizes in her book. It erases the work of these women as patients, but also the work of these women as nurses, right? Women who had expertise, who were trying to treat each other and to help to assuage some of the pain of these procedures. The current situation, as I understand it, is that the Parks Department approached some historians, myself included, to write a plaque that would describe the work of Anarcha, Lucy, and Betsy, but the East Harlem Preservation. The East Harlem Preservation Organization, along with local city council, have made it very clear that a plaque is insufficient. A position that I fundamentally agree with. I think that adding a plaque to the side of the Sims statue demeans ultimately the work that Anarcha and Betsy and Lucy did. So that's the current state of the conversation. I know, as I'm sure many people know, that the mayor of New York has just brought together a commission to talk about statues broadly in the city, and the Sims statue will be part of that conversation. But I guess what I'm going to ask you now is, like, how do we, what do you think the meaning of the Sims statue is, and how are we in 2015 to respond to the statue? Yeah.
So it's
17. I'm sorry, plus 2 years.
You know, it's interesting. I've only seen one of the statues, and it was when I was doing dissertation research in South Carolina, because I'm from there, and I had such a visceral response to seeing the statue that I made sure I did not want to see it. I did not want to see it when I moved to New York just 3 years ago. And so what I would say is, when you look at Sims's statue, and I put him alongside all of these other fathers, right, of our country, and certain professional branches of medicine, or, you know, whatever it is, we really have to reckon with their relationships to those people who they oppress. Right? And so, as much as I can laud his medical achievements, right, I don't think it was an exaggeration when Sims talks about the elation that these enslaved women had when they were repaired. They got able to return to their families, right? They were able to reproduce again. And these were young women. These were women of childbearing age. So there is an elation that you know, right, that it's real, that you are cured, that you are repaired. However, he is not linked to slavery. He is not linked to his exploitation of Mary Smith's body. And this is kind of the ending of Mary Smith's story. He botches her final surgery and then decides she is of no value to him. Whereas the enslaved women were at least of value because they were property, right? Mary Smith wasn't. So she loses her job and he sends her out to the street to become a beggar, and she dies in the street, right? And so to see that all of this has been excised from the historical narrative, and this is a country where people on the left, and in particular academics, are demonized about being politically correct, and yet there is no political correctness. There's no accuracy, there's no precision in language to these statues. Sims cannot be the exception. Sims, to me, represents the norm. And so we have to reckon with the ways that we have been telling a falsehood about American history and those men and women that we have propped up as heroes.
And I think, to be more specific, there's a story about the history of medicine. If we're looking at medical innovations that happened in the 19th century, and I'm just bracketing off the 20th century because I'm a historian of the 17th and the 18th century, we're looking at experiments that happen on enslaved or indigenous people. We're looking at cadavers who are stolen from who are stolen out of unmarked graves of enslaved people. Our colleague Dinah Ramey Berry's book, The Price for Their Pound of Flesh, talks very clearly about the value of dead Black bodies for medical to acquire medical knowledge. That's a piece of this history that has not until very recently been attended to, and I believe it would be interesting to know how, if this continues to be the case, but in the standard obstetric textbook that you use when you go to medical school as late as the 1990s, Sims is simply referred to as the father of American gynecology and the person who invented the speculum. And there's no discussion of whose body he invented that speculum on, or how he acquired the knowledge that he acquired. So for me, the statue really needs to be dealt with, because our responsibility, commemoration is supposed to be a collective act. The act of the nation, the act of the city, the act of the community, and the conversation around commemoration has to continue. So we need to. So I'm very comfortable in saying that, from my perspective, this statue needs to be moved to the cemetery where he is buried. He's buried in Brooklyn. Send it there, or send it somewhere else. Send it to the medical academy. And there needs to be a new statue that is a statue to Anarcha and Betsy and Lucy. This is a call. Many people have made this call, including actually today, Professor Susan Reverie, who is a historian of science and medicine, talked about the need for a new statue. And if we make a statue of those women and place it right there across from the Academy of Medicine and include the discussion of Sims while honoring them in some way, that will be a change in the conversation. And maybe 15 years from now or 20 years from now, we have to rethink commemoration again. But where we are right now, we have to think really carefully about how we are commemorating the past. How are we? And this is the mayor of New Orleans, Mitch Landrieu, says that there's a difference between remembering history and reverence, right? He says so, and this was in the context of removing 4 Confederate statues from the city of New Orleans. He says we can remember history, but we don't have to revere the Confederate past. We don't have to revere a past that is embedded in slavery. We have to remember it.
Yeah, it's interesting. So Sims, there's a cycle with Sims. And about every 8 years or so, there are new calls by different groups to remove his statue, or at least have conversations around it. So this is not a new conversation. For me, and I started my discussion today with centering Black women, that's where I'd like for us to return, right? So for me, regardless of whether his statue is there or not, right? I'm gonna just put that to the side. What is most important for me is understanding, is the legacy of Sims, is the legacy of medical racism still with us? And I would argue, yes. You know, so in many ways, you know, in no way am I gonna compare the experiences of 21st century medical patients with those who were enslaved. I think that does a disservice and disrespect to the memory of our ancestors. However, I would say, when you are training medical students who are graduating from the University of Virginia, from Harvard, from a number of highly ranked medical schools, and they fundamentally believe in biological distinctions between the difference of biological distinctions between Black and white people based on this idea that Black bodies do not experience as much pain as white bodies. And this is not a study that comes from 1944 or 1914, but from 2014, right? And so for me, it is literally going out and giving talks, doing workshops at medical schools, demanding in these interviews that I have, because they keep wanting me to talk about the Sims statue. And I'm like, let's talk about the legacy of Sims' racism. Let's talk about that medical legacy, right? And to talk about the ways that I think it is important to have medical humanities taught in these schools, to have conversations around ethics. I am also a proponent of fundamentally doing what a lot of our well-endowed universities are doing, and creating what I would say are either reparations programs or have some kind of endowment that ensures that our most vulnerable patients, and we know that our most vulnerable patients tend to be women, they tend to be poor people, they tend to be people of color, they tend to be these women's children, that they are protected. That their humanity is respected and recognized. This is not new, and I'm going to do what our feminist ancestors have done and make them personal political. And I talk about this in an article that I wrote for Rewire magazine. But I underwent fertility treatment not too long ago, and the fact that my cervix was dilated twice without anesthesia, and the doctor simply told me after my screams, oh, take a Motrin. And that was it. And so when I, of course, changed specialists and went to another fertility specialist and told her what happened, she was aghast. And yet she makes a comment, oh, I'm shocked that your womb is so small. I thought it'd be larger. And so those kinds of things, these are Vanderbilt University, one woman graduated from that, the other from Harvard Medical School. So these are people graduating from these programs with offices on Fifth Avenue. I went to an Upper East Side fertility specialist office, and yet, this assumption that my body was somehow fundamentally different than women patients, those are the things that for me, we also can't lose focus on. Anarcha, Betsy, Lucy, and all of her daughters and her granddaughters and their great-grandchildren are just as important to this conversation. And so I saw that the anonymous attendee asked, what is the responsibility of modern medicine to address this issue? So I'm hoping that that answers your question.
Yeah, I think that there's I know this from my relationship with NAPW. I know that there are students who are in medical school right now who are working around these issues of reproductive justice, around these issues of social responsibility. And I think that that's a huge call. But I also, as a historian, want to say that we're living in a moment in time right now where there is an active conversation that engages historians with the public to ask, what does it mean to commemorate the past? What does it mean in New York City to recognize and acknowledge the role of slavery in building a major medical institution in this city, as well as throughout the Northeast? How do we engage in that conversation? And to that end, I think it's very important that those of us who live in New York make our feelings known to the mayor and to the mayor's commission. I think that it's important that those of you who live in other cities do the work to understand how our commemorative gestures are located at a particular moment in time. I wanted to just remind everyone that the Sims statue, which was originally in Bryant Park, was dedicated in 1894, right? Well after he performed these experiments, and it was moved to Fifth Avenue in 1934. In 1934, the decision to commemorate Sims happened in New York City. This is not a moment of our distant past. It's a moment that is connected to our relatively recent past, and that's something I think that we need to grapple with as well.
And to also have a frank conversation that I think we're all having here today about whose history matters. The fact that I can come to New York and find out that the African burial ground was underneath, right? Was hidden underneath, and I don't know if it was a parking lot or some stores or something, but that if we say we really care about American history, and yet the only ones that we're having conversations around are dead white men, who, in Sims's case, he was not the only person doing this kind of work. He just knew how to brand himself in a very particular way. He was a prolific medical writer. To think about the ways that, the privileging of Sims's physical representation still outweighs those men and women whose names are in the historical record, right? That is just called the African burial ground, and we don't even know who they are. And yet Sims takes up so much of our conversation when I'm really, once again, I think with the work that we're doing, we're saying, look, he has to be connected to slavery. And in fact, we need to teach more about slavery in this country and the contributions of those folks who were made to work because they didn't have a choice.
And yeah, go ahead.
No, and I
know we're almost at the end.
I know, and I apologize if we're not going to get to all the questions, but I just want to acknowledge that one of the legacies of the racism as well as slavery is the extraordinary high maternal mortality rate, especially among Black women. And the mythology of pain and lack of it, I saw too in the Ferguson case, where there was a belief by the people of Medical University Hospital that the only women arrested were those who had been offered treatment and didn't get it. And it was a lie that they really believed. And two things were clear. They had not been offered treatment, or three things. There was no treatment, and this policy was put into place right after Hurricane Hugo, when all the prenatal care programs had been shut down. And it turns out, and maybe you can tell me if this is correct, that there was a whole body of literature that said Black people don't follow through on treatment.
Yeah.
So you believe that it was offered when it was never part.
I mean, there is the legacy. We can speak very broadly about this, and we can speak specifically about issues of gynecological experimentation. But part of what happens is you move. So when Sims is performing his procedures in Alabama, the impetus was to return these women to their childbearing possibilities, right? As soon as slavery is over, as soon as the Emancipation Proclamation happened as we move to the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century, the impetus is to stop Black women from having babies. Yes. So the terms of experimentation change, and the ways in which poor people in North Carolina and throughout the South are subjected to experiments around spermicide and birth control, the way that teenage girls in inner city communities are injected with Norplant, et cetera. Like, there's a thread here that we are not the only ones saying this. This is a thread that scholars of 20th to 21st century medicine and people who work in legal advocacy are very well aware of.
Yeah.
Well,
But
and even there, for another non-medical, but we have an entire child welfare system in this country that is increasingly based on destruction of family based on nothing more than a positive drug test. And it is a completely evidence-based free zone. There is nothing there is virtually no peer-reviewed research that supports any of the assumptions underlying that destruction, primarily of brown and black.
Exactly, because the presumption is that Black and brown women are not good mothers. And if that's your point of entry, then whatever happens after that, the state is authorized to do, right?
We have just a few minutes. I don't know if there are any of the questions there that you feel like you'd like to answer in our remaining 3 minutes.
So the questions, I wondered about Rebecca Williams' questions. Is there evidence that any of the women who received surgery did not want the surgery performed?
So because of the evidence we have, all of the evidence is essentially written by white men, the white men who perform these procedures,
so
they would not. The only thing I have done is, there's a kind of methodology of reading between the lines, so you can see this when they talk about she resisted violently or had to be held down by another assistant. And so those are ways that I can pick up without this woman's voice actually being in the text that there was at least some physical resistance to some of the surgeries being performed.
And I would just very quickly say in answer to this last question about why has Sims tended not to appear in bioethics curricula, I believe that Sims is beginning to appear in bioethical curricula. I feel that there, I know some people who are in medical school who have begun to, who know his name as more than the father of gynecology. But I think that we still have a way to go before Sims is as well known as the Tuskegee experiment.
Yes. Yeah. I think Sharice Loader just said we need a reproductive justice curriculum. Yes, we do.
Absolutely.
And if you want, email me because I've been trying to do this with medical schools.
And I think Sharice is actually working on
it.
Great.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful.
And one,
Hey.
All right. So I don't want to start answering something I don't have time for. What do we have?
We have 1 minute.
We have 1 minute. I mean, I think that we need to, those of us who are, I think we come to this from a number of different perspectives, as historians, as legal activists, as community members, as people who are fighting for reproductive justice, and we just need to link up our very overlapping concerns.
Yes.
And that the link between those of us who are 19th century historians, those of us who are 17th century historians, and those of us who are working in the 21st century are really tangible. They're not just metaphors. They are really substantive and important connections.
So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you all for participating. We will be sending out further information, and if we didn't get to answer your question, please feel free to contact NAPW and we can pass those on.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.